Okay, so welcome. I'd like to thank everybody for being here and for being interested in this program. Um, I'll give a little bit of background first, really about some of my work, and I know some of you are familiar, but I've trained and worked as a chaplain in a host of different settings, hospital chaplaincy, hospice chaplaincy, and then for New York City Department of Correction on Rikers Island. And this program has been a lot of fun to vision, primarily because I wish something like this existed when I was moving into chaplaincy in the very beginning phases. I trained uh, in a program that was Buddhist oriented, which was nice, and it was really primarily Zen based in approach, which, while Buddhist, still required a tremendous amount of translation for me, right, out of the Tibetan tradition into a Zen based tradition, which I respect and love and all this, but it wasn't really my kind of heart uh, language, so to speak. And so over the actually some of this started last year. I started envisioning this program that would introduce for people a real solid basis in Vajrayana spiritual formation practices, uh, and also introduce people to the kind of some of the realities of what's involved in training as a chaplain, um, based on some of the competencies that are tracked by ACPE, which is one of the two main organizations that certify chaplains. And that's the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education. And some of these, I'll kind of name some of these. Some of these they're not necessarily new ideas, I think, to everybody gathered here. But one thing that I had noticed over time was, in interacting with some Vajrayana sanghas that were interested in people approaching chaplaincy, the the approach is rather wooden, so like, for end of life care, you learn poa, right, which is a good traditional thing to do. But the truth is, right, how many people are you going to meet in the world who are going to exactly know what POA is exactly? And then how does the chaplain or pastoral caregiver, because this program could be applicable for people who are social workers or psychologists or anything, people who want to bring the wisdom of the tradition in a and to people who might not necessarily be practitioners. So how do I language this, right? How do I introduce what POA could be for a Catholic patient or for somebody of no faith, right? And so the need to kind of translate some of what we find in the tradition into the caregiving setting requires a little bit of support and education for people who are interested in doing this. And this is another kind of key component for this program. But so some of these kind of competencies are, learning to articulate an approach to spiritual care rooted in one's faith and spiritual tradition that's integrated with kind of theories and ideas around clinical practice that you find in a professional setting, to incorporate a working knowledge of different ethical theories appropriate to the clinical context, articulating ways in which one's feelings and attitudes and values and assumptions affect caregiving. And this is a real good one around blind spots, right? And there are so many different kinds of blind spots one finds, within a caregiving setting. These can include blind spots around people's identities, blind spots around what we might assume is a common languaging around faith issues, or spiritual concerns, around class, around all the different kinds of differences that can exist within the relationships and the issues that people face who need spiritual support. And so what we've done is create this 2-year program, the first of which is split up into trimesters, where we begin with this kind of very common Vajrayana presentation of outer, inner, and secret, right? And so the outer focuses mostly on development of self, including ethics, right? And we go through Theravadan view, like ethical considerations, Mahayana ethical considerations, Vajrayana ethical considerations, right? So so as to then have the people who are engaged in the program to really kind of it's not that you have to adhere to all of these, but you have to be familiar with them, and that helps to be able to develop an ethical viewpoint or point of departure for yourself, which then becomes one of the kind of capstone projects of the first trimester, is really exploring what your ethical basis for spiritual care is, right? Spiritual practice, spiritual care. Then we'll move into inner. Outer will also include the introduction of some nunjo techniques, for people to practice, gain familiarity with. It's not necessarily the case that you have to master these things, but again, gaining a solid basis, right, in Vajrayana spiritual formation is kind of one of the key components to this. So that you know what you're doing, and you have a basis, right? This is really important if you're going to be a spiritual caregiver. The next trimester, which is inner, goes a little bit more deeply into practice with yidam practice, right? So deity yoga, including visualizing, receiving empowerment for both Vajravarahi practice and Cho practice, and then instruction on this. But then again, this exploration of like, what actually are these processes, right? And how can this be transferred in relationship to people who are in need of spiritual care support? And this is kind of fun because it involves kind of taking the practices apart, exploring the dynamics, the power of mantra, the power of prayer, the power of visualization, right? The idea of empowerment, right? What does it mean to help support somebody so that they feel spiritually empowered? And then in the third trimester, then we'll look at what's the secret level, and this is really Mahamudra and Dzogchen, which in this context have much more to do with the benefit that these practices, these non-conceptual practices, have in cultivating a non-judgmental spiritual presence, right? So deep listening, right? Settling into a relationship to appearance, which includes being in relationship to others and being highly attuned to need, attuned to communication, different kinds of communication, verbal communication, non-verbal communication, or even the objects that people are bringing to, if they're in like a hospice setting or a hospital setting, people usually will bring things for the bedside, and all of these things become these important symbols that are useful for the spiritual caregiver to help engage and help explore with whoever one is working with, to discuss what's important spiritually. Within both years, the first year will be joined by Dr. Nita Chinatsang at various points, and Lama Rod Owens, a really dear friend of mine, and a chaplain educator named Christopher Funkhauser. He'll be joining, and then also a host of Buddhist chaplains who have, gone through CPE, and they'll come in and they'll talk, give presentations, and then also help people through this exploration of like, what does it really mean to take our spiritual practice and get involved in aligning with the practice of a more quote unquote professional pastoral care giving setting. And then the second year is really great because it's mostly clinical. So there'll be classes as well, and then people will be out in the field of their choice. Right, it could be, volunteering at a hospital, hospice, a community center. I've kind of worked with some students who are interested in like working in their community, right? And it could be a really organized way, or it could be a little bit more of an organic way. Could be really kind of, any setting where you would be relied on as a spiritual support for people. So it could be, within the context of a protest movement. It could be within the context of some people have reached out about working in the trans communities, right? And providing spiritual support for people, and kind of the translation of this, Vajrayana practices to that end. It could be in soup kitchens. It could be, in some kind of ecumenical chaplaincy context. But the key point with the second year is actually going out into the world and doing the work. With both years, there are classes 2 days a week, not full days, but 2 hours in length. The first is kind of more of a educational class, which will either be led by myself or any of the guest teachers, Lama Rod, Dr. Nita Chinatsan, and others, including, I think, a couple of psychologists who want to be able to join in and talk about supervision, talk about trauma, trauma-informed care, things like this. And then the second class, though, is peer-led, right? And this is really where the cohort gets to support one another, learn from one another, take things apart together, examine, explore, etc. And in the second year, the kind of key breakdown is, rather than the first year, which is broken down into trimesters, which is, break down by outer, inner, and secret. The second year is broken into self, other, and then land, right? And so self is, working on oneself, right? As a caregiver in the field, as it were, learning, learning how to deal with somebody saying, like, get away from me, like, I'm good, I don't need any help, right? And then learning what to do there, right? When you get hot and bothered or triggered or this kind of thing. Another example is, even though we might show up with really positive intentions, sometimes we might show up in a rather wooden and unexamined way, right? Assuming that the people totally understand where we're coming from. And then learning how to be able to be comfortable in being redirected by the person that you're working with. And doing so in a way where one is able to access the necessary humility and compassion and an ability to kind of just go with the flow, which is necessary for being in relationship that way. The second of the trimesters for the second year will be on other, right? And so this is really like, working with people who may be different than us, right? Or again, deep listening, or what happens when conflict arises in a pastoral care relationship. What happens when conflict arises with people that you might be working with in the clinical location. This is actually very common in chaplaincy, where sometimes the business model of the hospital or hospice, or the corrections in particular, the politics around it, might differ than what the pastoral caregiver might see is important, right? This is the kind of difference between the heart and the kind of organizational mind um, of a location. Also, with a big emphasis with both of these and looking at our shadow side, right? Our blind spots, and yeah, particularly looking at those. And then the last is land, and we kind of termed it as like the sweet return to the mandala. And then this is looking at not only our caregiving as a mandala structure, but then the location where we might be serving as a mandala, looking at our own spiritual life, quote unquote, mandala structure. And really, the last piece really being a celebration of the construction that we've been involved in, up to this point, right? Because at the end, it's important, this work is not easy. And one of the reasons why it's not easy is because, in order to be a really pliant and compassionate support for others, we really need to be able to look at ourselves and look at ourselves in ways that can be a little hard sometimes, right? Recognize where, wow, I'm really being stubborn, right? Or where I get activated, or, what kind of personality type really activates me in the moment. And it doesn't mean that by the end of the 2 years we'll all be perfect, but it does mean that we will probably know a lot more about ourselves, A. B, will be very, securely rooted in Dharma practice, which, I know that a lot of folks here already are. But we can always be better, right? And that's what this is really kind of rooted in, right? One could already have gone through 4 units of clinical pastoral education, and this program would still be a benefit, right? Or somebody could be in a social work profession, or working towards that, and this could be a benefit. Or, as we find now in a lot of sanghas just across the board, given this kind of, the aging out of the boomer generation, so to speak, you have larger numbers of people in sanghas who are finding themselves, at the very least, moving into, being older, and some of these issues, especially around end of life spiritual care, becoming very prominent. And so even if one is coming from a sangha and they just want to focus their attention on being able to be a designated pastoral caregiver for a sangha, right? This is also a really appropriate way of honing these skills. While all of this is happening, we're in the early stages of this now, but over the course of these 2 years, then we will be developing a certified Vajrayana chaplaincy program that will be able to offer clinical pastoral education. And that is really the gold standard for chaplaincy in the United States. The clinical pastoral education is designated by ACPE as really, the kind of key thing that will lead to board certification if one is interested in that. Typically, you don't need board certification necessarily to work as a chaplain, but these days, you definitely need, generally speaking, 4 units of clinical pastoral education in order to be hired as a chaplain. Definitely in hospital settings, like in the medical fields, and in hospice. And then when I worked, I was the head of chaplaincy and staff wellness for New York City Department of Correction. And when we were interviewing for chaplains, we always really kind of preferred that, because it meant that people had all of these competencies down, which are necessary to if one really wants to be a skilled caregiver. So this is kind of like the core essence of it. It will be fun. it will be a little hard. It will be deep. Um, and I think it's going to be really powerful. Like I said, this is something that I've spent at least a year and a half really kind of contemplating, and just about a whole year kind of reviewing, building this out, asking people to take a look at it, reviewing, and also daydreaming about, how can, like the Vajrayana spiritual care world is one that's really, really important to me. And there's so few places to be able to get this kind of training that, rather than complaining about it, I was like, okay, fine, you need to do something about this. And this is a little bit of a nicer alternative and cheaper than going to div school. And going to div school, if you're a Vajrayana Buddhist practitioner, there aren't many good options, really, in my opinion. There are options, but this is a little bit more fluid, a little bit more dynamic, which I think is good, and is pretty well suited for people who have commitments, work commitments, life commitments, family commitments, etc., school commitments, whatever it is. So I wanted to just kind of maybe open the floor to see if people have questions, specific questions, thoughts or curiosities about this. You can just, you could raise your hand, or use the emoji thing. But Cassandra, I saw your hand.
Hi, Lama Justin.
Hey.
I'm wondering I would like to hear you explain what you think Vajrayana Buddhism uniquely has to offer to spiritual care that you don't find in, like, Zen, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So, we have, the Buddhist tradition is definitely death friendly, impermanence friendly. Vajrayana, though, has, a lot of practices, for example, like Poa, Bardo yoga, Cha. There's a really strong ethos. And of course, this is not just unique to Vajrayana, but within the context of Vajrayana, the use of mantra, the use of visualization, also this idea of charnel grounds, right? And as practitioners, being able to move through difficult spaces and making a home there. And again, not necessarily, I'm not going to make the claim this is only Vajrayana, but in Vajrayana, we find these things being particularly powerful. Within the context of, mantra and visualization, and it's not just intense things. There are practices like Chenrezi, Tara, practice, a whole host of things. And then Vajrayana, of course, is, depending on the presentation, is built upon the firm basis of the Mahayana tradition. And so there's a lot of similarities there. And there are some things, though, that are more unique to, like, I guess we could say, like, the Himalayan developments within the context of Mahayana, like the developments around things like Lojong that came up in the Kadampa, early Kadampa tradition in Tibetan Buddhism. So there's a lot. And it's, again, the kind of key aspect of this program is to be able to introduce a lot of these things for people who wish to be introduced to them, practice them traditionally, but then also be supported in really breaking them open and looking at the dynamics at play behind these. And then how, for example, like, when I was training, there was a friend in one of my cohorts who was a Vajrayana practitioner and suffered in silence with me, and he was very interested in Poa, and had a Catholic patient, this elderly Catholic woman, and he he got curious. He began to describe the dynamics of Paula for her, and kind of led her in this guided visualization when she was, close to dying, where she, for all practical purposes, kind of ejected her consciousness into the essence of Mary, Mother Mary, right? And this led her to this, like, experience of beauty and transformation in the moment, and a sense of grace. And this was a really beautiful way to be able to kind of take a really traditional dynamic that you find in a practice and translate it out for somebody from a different faith tradition. um, and to be frank, in the Vajrayana traditions, it's not uncommon to find sanghas where people are really, like, orthodox and kind of like hardcore, or maybe you can even say a little stodgy at times, about wanting to engage in these kinds of, creative reimaginations of these practices. And though I understand that impulse to not innovate, I'll also say, though, it's a huge skillful means to actually do that, and kind of bring this wisdom outward. So hopefully that's helpful.
Wow,
Uh,
that's so beautiful. Thank you.
yeah, thank you. Raf, how are you? Are you
I'm
muted?
great. I
Oh,
hope you're
good.
doing well.
I am, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Hell
you.
yeah. Good to see you. Yeah, so pretty clear-cut question. I'm just wondering, well, double checking when the program starts, like January?
In January, that's correct.
Okay. And wondering if you think this is would be at all appropriate or compatible, even just like basic schedule wise, with CPE residency at hospital for a year.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah, because the classes
Mhm.
are, they're 2 hours twice a week, but they're also recorded. And I'm I want to be as flexible for people as possible, so I don't want to put a, like, big emphasis on, you have to be here for, yeah, let's just say it would be great to be live for half of them if you can be. But I know you, and I know your dedication to chaplaincy. So, in the event, and I also just want to acknowledge that our lives are busy and people have a lot of different kinds of commitments, that should life get hard or complicated, but one still feels like they are able to kind of, track and participate. We could say the classes in the beginning of the week, which are the kind of more quote unquote educational ones, you can, watch whenever you like. And then the cohort based peer led ones will be a lot of fun. I think those are on Thursdays, if I'm not mistaken. Um, those will be good to try to make, just so that, there's a sense of uh, cohesion in the cohort. Um, but yeah, there's flexibility.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and theoretically, I would try my best and would definitely communicate to them like, hey, would I be able to have these times blocked off? But I've never done a year long at hospital before, so I figure they may easily just be like, we can't do that. But yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ralph. So good to see you. Yeah, MJ, how are you?
Good. Thanks, Lama. This is really exciting to me, someone who's done some chaplaincy before. I wonder if there's any sort of requirement for like you need to come to a physical location to do like like a retreat or something as part of that program.
Not for this one, no. So with respect to the CPE program that we're developing, it wouldn't be a retreat, but there are some rules that we're just double checking with ACPE about. There has to be like a little bit of cohort, I guess cohesive cohort time. But for this, no. So this is entirely online. And again, should people want to self organize something like this, like one of the cohort saying, hey, we want to do like a long weekend together, we could explore doing that. But again, my kind of primary concern is making this as accessible to people as possible. And, online tends to work best for that.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I have two more.
Please, yeah.
Is there going to be a homework assignments? I mean, I'm imagining yes, but
Yes,
what
yeah.
would the homework load be like?
Not too bad. When we were developing this, we are really trying to keep this a joyful a joyful process. So there are combinations of a lot of it is personal reflection because again, really like with any kind of training like this, it's really the integrity to the personal integrity on the part of the participant that is really going to ensure that the person learns, right? You can lay out the entire curriculum and that's one thing, but the energy that people bring is going to be the thing that really solidifies whether or not all of this takes. So some of this will actually be some assignments will be poetic in nature. Write a poem, write an ethics statement, write a reflection on you know actually like your blind spots and the things that you assume to be based on your own assessment of yourself, shadow uh you know shadow work. There will be one verbatim exercise, which actually is really helpful too for folks who are going to be moving into CPE after this, if they feel that they're interested. And this is actually, I don't know if have you done a verbatim?
I forget what that means exactly.
Yeah, so it's actually really kind of a fascinating process where you take, as best as one can remember, an interaction with a person that you're working with, and you write out basically the script of how it went, for the a good portion of the meeting, and then you present this to your peers, and your peers act it out, and then your peers kind of break down where where we fell down, right? Like what we missed, maybe how we could have done things differently. And it's really amazing because I know somebody who just as an experiment made one up. And they were like, they're like, I don't even know if this is a real thing, so I'm going to make it up and bring it to a chaplaincy class. And they did that, and what came out was really powerful for them. So it's a really it's a very vulnerable thing to do, and when you do CPE, there's a certain number you have to do per unit of CPE. But so I figured we could do one in the second year as a way to kind of introduce people to this form of learning. But each week there will be some thing to submit, but it's most likely a reflection, a poem, and it's not a lot. I wanted to kind of also be respectful of the fact that people have jobs, school, other things that they're doing, but it is adequate to actually have everything kind of settled in their consciousness.
Thank you. Yeah, one more thing. So this initial year or 2 years, 2-year program, is it a certification? Is it just sort of a pilot program? What would you get out of that, I guess, besides the experience itself after you're graduated?
So the experience itself is one of the things. The other thing is for people who are interested in moving towards MDiv equivalency, part of the certificate will have all of the hours listed for practice, all of the hours listed for education, all of the hours listed for clinical work. All of these things are translatable towards what's called MDiv equivalency. And so ACPE has they issued what's known as a white paper on equivalency for Buddhist chaplains, because unlike other faith traditions, there really isn't a unified seminary structure for Buddhist chaplains. And within the context of so you could go to the div school, for example, and get your MDiv. But if you didn't want to do that, there's an equivalency process by which you submit the hours you do in practice, in study, theological reflection, etc. And then these are all they have to be approved, and there's an interview process and all of this, and then you can receive MDiv equivalency. So I have one friend who's a palliative care chaplain, Buddhist palliative care chaplain, who's in this process right now, and I know people who have gotten through it. The other thing that we're happy to provide are letters of ecclesiastic endorsement or support for people who are going to be moving into chaplaincy as well. And this is actually for my friend who's a palliative care chaplain. This is one of the things I'm in the process of doing right now. So it's so we can offer these, and then once we have the accreditation for CPE, then all of those things will be accredited by ACPE.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, MJ. Is it Gina?
Yeah, it's Gina. Hi.
Hi.
A lot of my questions were asked and answered, but I'm sort of new to the training, the chaplaincy training idea.
Mm-hmm.
I'm working as a care manager in a hospital, and then before that I worked like almost 10 years as a home health case manager. So I've wanted to kind of explore and go further into how I can work with people kind of around these times of life, more in the spiritual front. I'm also a practitioner, Buddhist practitioner. So yeah, I guess that was one of my questions, was just about like, what do you walk away with? I know there's like a year-long program at Dartmouth, which is kind of near where I live at the hospital, where they it's like a clinical pastoral education program. So I wasn't sure like how would, like, if I did this for 2 years and then can you kind of then do like another year at this program? Or I guess I'm not totally up on all the options.
Yeah, no, thank you, Gina. So with this program, well, we're not clinical, this is not a clinical pastoral education program. It's
Okay.
you can think of it as a spiritual formation program. And why is this important? It's important because when you get into CPE, clinical pastoral education, it's one commonly meets with clergy. Your fellow cohort members tend to be clergy, right? They could be Protestant, Catholic, from various Muslim denominations or various Jewish denominations, Hindu denominations, etc. What is really interesting about Buddhist chaplains who train is that they often don't have a lot of spiritual formation, under their belt, other than personal practice, which I'm not saying is not a good thing, but it helps, right, to develop a basis in relationship to your practice that is, helps it give not necessarily shared by other faith traditions in terms of structure, but a kind of gravity to how you show up as a caregiver. When kind of exactly who you are and how you identify and where you find your sources of spiritual strength, it becomes much more you become a much more effective spiritual presence for others. If this is something that you're kind of weighing out and determining as you engage CP, that's okay, right? But there isn't necessarily the same breadth of experience, knowledge, wisdom that you're pulling from, if that makes sense. And yeah, so it makes for a much more effective chaplain, I think. you know. And I think this is something where, like, Buddhist chaplaincy typically, especially with respect to Vajrayana folks, just is frankly in need of some bolstering when we look at what we find in other faith traditions. Like when I was training, like two of my clinical locations, one was Cornell Weill Medical Center, and there was an incredible imam who had been yeah, he'd been like working in his mosque for like 13 years as the lead imam before coming to CPE. And he was just so firmly rooted in his faith tradition that it was wonderful. I could turn to him, and especially if I came across Muslim patients and I had a just a technical question for him, oh, Imam Ali, can you please help me with understanding this or that, or why is this this way? And he was able to fill me in, right, and be my teacher in that way. And so for us, right, like there's the impulse to want to be a spiritual presence for others is very, very noble and important, but so is having that nice firm basis. And the best basis is just having it within ourselves. So this is really kind of what this gets to, and then from there you have a really good platform to build on CPE training if that feels good. Yeah.
The second year, did you say so mostly clinical, like, is there a sort of a time, like number of hours a week type of thing, for that kind of practicum?
Yes, so it can be anywhere from, it depends on people's schedules, but a minimum of 4 hours a week,
Okay.
clinical experience, up to 6 or 8 depending. And again, the reason why this is it's not as large as you might, or larger numbers you might find in chaplaincy training, but this is really to kind of also just cut your teeth, as it were. Because again, chaplaincy is funny, because even if you do CPE, right, you will have no experience. Show up, they give you a little badge, and then send you to your floors, your units, right? And so let's say you're starting, and then all of a sudden, like, you're the chaplain of the like neuro step down unit, right? And it's like, oh my god, like I've never never even been on a unit like that. And then now I'm ministering to people who are recovering from strokes or seizures or traumatic brain injuries or stuff like that. So chaplaincy is fascinating this way. It's definitely like a foot to the fire kind of training. So this is a little step up in that direction.
Right. That helps. I had one other little question.
Mhm.
So when we learn, or when we go over like the different practices in Vajrayana, or Mahayana, or the different components, is it the kind of thing where, like, if we're looking into Nundra, where we're gonna like do a whole bunch of repetitions or practices, or is it more like you're just learning it in the moment, but you're not necessarily practicing it all week or whatever?
Yeah. No, and if you like.
Okay.
So there's this piece around when these things are introduced. They're being introduced with the how to say, like, no pressure that you need to this needs to become the fundamental basis of your spiritual life, but that a point of connection to practice X or practice Y and some familiarity with it is truly helpful. The nunja that we'll be introducing is the nunja for the Yutod Nintik, which beautiful thing about it is it can be done in a 7-day personal retreat if one wants to, right? And if one can't take the time for the 7 days, then we're offering kind of a structure for no sweat. We can do this over this trimester, right? Like, how many hours a week would one give to it? And what that at least does, right, is it gives people a sense of accomplishment around the practices, right? Because again, you know, within the context of CPE, for example, like one of the things one needs to learn how to do is to be a strong pastoral presence for others, right? And so being a strong pastoral presence for others also requires us, in one way, right, to be deeply rooted in our relationship to practice. And it doesn't mean that we're going to be telling people, okay, like, do these, do 1 mile around of this mantra, and then, come call me in the morning and I'll come back and see how you're doing. You'll be healed. But what it does mean, right, is like, again, practice is a way of rooting ourselves in to a type of resilience that allows us to be there for others and confident in ourselves. So there won't be like, it's not I make a joke. I make a lot of jokes for those who are not who are new to me or whatever, but this is not a cult, right? So we're not saying like, you do these practices and then, here you go, here's your piece of paper and to pay your dues. Everything has been selected to be able to help provide a stable, knowledgeable basis in Vajrayana Buddhist practice that can then empower you to continue, right? Continue on in the way that feels best.
Thank you.
Thank you. Michael.
Howdy.
Hey.
I had a question on kind of some of the practical stuff.
Mhm.
I was wondering if there's going to be like a syllabus or something for reference on like
Yes.
how this is going to be happening.
Yeah, there is a syllabus, and I can what I can do is we have, so some of this is on like drip release, like on the learning platform, which means it's kind of like release bit by bit. But should anybody, let me see, I can share some of this actually right now. Yeah, so here is some of this syllabus. So and we can get this up on there too. So year one, we will be moving through, so here it is, 12 weeks long, the first cohort, or first trimester, 2 days a week, with one is instructor based, and then the other one is facilitated with peer-led exploration. But so we'll begin January. So we'll be exploring ethics, stepping into the experiences of illness, bereavement, death, the idea of a charnel ground, and then moving into the inner. So that was outer, inner. Here we introduced deity yoga, familiarization with the Bardo process. Not only like the way it's presented traditionally, but then also some of the clinical ways in which the dying process and the lead up to the dying process typically appears. We'll be doing the Shije Vajravarahi practice. Everyone will receive the Chill empowerment and reading transmissions for various Chill practices. And then the teaching instruction on Poa and Bardo yoga found in the Karma Kaju and also the Yuta Nintik lineages. I could also squeeze in probably like the Luncheon Nintik Poa practice too. And it's a little helpful to kind of see these things, side by side, as it were. And then how to, like how in the world to bring these for others in real world clinical contexts, right? And this is actually kind of important. The study of the barter process will serve as an in-depth way of not only understanding how the dying process works, but also how the aspiring chaplain or caregiver can identify the ways in which the elements dissolve into one another before physical death, based on physiological signs that begin to appear sometimes weeks or even months before physical death occurs. And this is something I've charted and seen in my work in hospice. And then Secret, September 9th through November 29th. And here we'll be looking at Mahamudra and Dzogchen or Hatha Yoga. And then, especially looking at how these things can apply to the cultivation of an open, non-judgmental presence and an ethos of radical acceptance, integral to staying attuned to the needs of those for whom spiritual care is being offered. And let's see. And so these are, I'll have this up. The person who is helping me with this, getting this on the learning platform, will probably be able to do this week. And yeah, so a lot of this language, I think we've already seen. But then so then we've got like if there's one other document, actually, I might be able, here we go. This one. Yes. So this has this is more of a working document, right? But so, for example, like when we talk about the Bardo, we'll be looking at having Dr. Nida come in to teach the Utuknintik Bardo practice, and the Karma Kaju Bardo practice I'll teach. And then I'll share some reflections on Yangti, or dark retreat practice as it connects to Bardo. We'll be doing the Utuknintik Dakini practice, charnel ground practice. We'll be discussing the various Yogini Tantra practices. So this is more of a working document, but some of the examples, so one of the capstone projects, the capstone project for year one is, write the story of your spiritual formation or your spiritual biography. This is like an example of some of the work, or here too, like, what is your relationship to shadow work? Where do you envision going with it? Embracing the shadow, finding light within our own places of darkness and trauma-informed spiritual practice. When we look at ethics, ethics from the Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, traditions. So, yeah, is that helpful, Michael? This is kind of a taste.
Very much so. I was also wondering about materials that we might need to purchase, like books and or other things.
Yeah, the only things will be books, and the reading list we can share. In the coming weeks. For people who want to take time to consider.
And I guess my last question on this is, I'm looking at the payment plans for doing this, and I was wondering when should we have our first payment done to enroll in course?
Oh, I mean, it could even be the end of December, the beginning, even right before the first class. That should be fine.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So Cassandra, if you want to put the little emoji reaction thing up with the hand raised. Amy.
Hi, Lama Justin, and just so you know, it's Ami.
Ami, I'm sorry.
Everyone, no problem. So I have some very practical questions just to make sure that I understand. So as I understand it, the first 2 years basically are an MDiv equivalency preparation as well as a foundation for chaplaincy. Is that correct?
Yes, now, full disclosure, it's not all that's needed for an MDiv equivalency, right? So there is a link if you, I'll look it up while I talk. So, but it can work towards that, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so it sounds like, well, these initial programs going on, you'll be preparing and certifying CPE, and that then would be year 3 for anyone who wanted to become a certified chaplain. That would create the
That would be the
foundation.
yeah, it's the foundation for moving into chaplaincy. So like CPE. So the thing is, oh, here we go. So let me put this link in the chat. So certification as a chaplain requires a whole lot of things, including either an MDiv or MDiv equivalency. And so so this is the white paper that describes the MDiv equivalency. So in order to become certified as a board certified, you need to have either an MDiv or an MDiv equivalency, and then 4 units of clinical pastoral education. And so this is before, like, this program is really the lead up to beginning clinical pastoral education. And again, the kind of key thing is, just a solid foundation in Vajrayana practice and theory, and the application of caregiving before beginning CPE. So like, you don't need to become board certified necessarily in order to work as a chaplain. And for example, my friend who's a palliative care chaplain that I described before has worked at a major hospital in New York City for, at this point, 7 years, and is only now going for board certification at this time. So it's not absolutely necessary. It is a big commitment. Some people do it, some people don't. Frankly, some workplaces might develop a deadline by which people need to do it. But I just want to be super clear that this program does not, let you, it doesn't make you board certified.
Right. And then the other question I have is, where does chaplain ordination fit in? And is that something you're considering offering people if they wish?
Yes. Oh, I have done this for people. I've done this through Bhumi Sparsha, and I'm in the process of getting Yangti Yoga Retreat Center set up in this capacity as well. So and with these, so I've been able to, and I mean, I have the ability to be able to do this myself, just given my own kind of endorsement and status as a within the tradition. I'm more than happy to write letters of ecclesiastic support and ordination for people in that direction, definitely. The key thing is especially if somebody goes through this, then they're known to me. It's very easy for me to vouch for them and be a support. And I can't remember how many people we've done it for, but enough. In Vajrayana Sanghas, this is really hard. I just did this for somebody who's a chaplain at Yale Medical Center, because their Sangha wouldn't do it. So as a means of supporting Vajrayana practitioners who need this, absolutely, we'll do this. Yeah, thank you, Emmy. Aaron, how are you?
I'm a little bit better than I was yesterday, but a little scratchy still.
Good.
But good. I'm really excited about this program. I do have some questions. I'm curious about if there's anything that we'll go into in this program about like crisis counseling or therapeutic communication. I don't know how common that is in chaplaincy in general, but I've just spoken with some nurses where that was like an important part of their training was the therapeutic communication. So they're not like necessarily, they're aware in a way that they are a presence for people without necessarily giving advice. And yeah, just those sort of things that are a little more, I guess, secular in nature almost. We'll be covering anything like that.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. I'll be offering some of this because I've done a lot of this in jails, for example. So not just like, I've done it in healthcare settings too. But when let's just say when things are getting real, so to speak, on a floor in a hospital, or even hospice, and of course, other locations. Yes, these kinds of things will be shared, and then some of the guest presenters who will be coming in are chaplains who have done some incredible work in this context. And there's one in particular who it's like her specialty. Her specialty is like being in these really intense locations and being able to provide support for nursing staff and clinical staff as well, and kind of bridging the communication gap that can arise in these crisis settings. There's also a therapist with a big very kind of substantial background as a trauma specialist who will be coming in to talk about clinical based therapeutic communication, in that way as well.
Cool, very cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask, so I haven't done any deep diving on this yet, but I kind of casually looked around and I was looking at different LGBT health centers or community centers, things like that. I didn't really find a lot of places that had chaplains. So I'm wondering if that's kind of the focus where you would like to be, if there is a way that you can like approach them and like pitch this if they don't have a pre-existing like chaplaincy program or residence or anything like that. I don't know, is there any way to kind of get your foot in the door with some of these places that don't have something like that?
Yeah, I'm happy to work with you directly on that. And anybody, who is especially wanting to take this in places where there aren't typically chaplains, so to speak, right? And so why this is important to me is like, getting, pastoral care out there in places where it might not have been up to this point. So I'm happy to kind of workshop that with you, and we can go from there.
Yeah, I'd love that. And my follow-up question that's kind of related to that is, if for whatever reason I or anyone else ends up going a route that is not through a like formal facility, but like wants to be a little more direct with community. I don't know like how you would go about like modeling that or like setting it up, and then like how would you log hours or things like that. Yeah, I that's a little more of a fuzzy question. I'm just having a hard time, I guess, imagining right now what that could look like. But it is something that could appeal to me if I don't go through like a health center or a community center or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So because this is really about supporting people in gaining the experience of providing, pastoral care for others, I'm again much more interested in doing things that haven't been done before, And so we can totally work that out, even if it's just I mean, there's so many different options. And I'll give you an example. Like earlier this year, some folks from city government, New York City government, and actually Union Theological Seminary, and I got on a call about trying to come up with a plan for the city to develop chaplains to work in homeless shelters. And we workshopped this thing. It took a couple months, and and ultimately got shut down by the city. But what was developed was a plan that could have been easily done just with volunteers, or just with people who felt motivated to do that work. And so I'm bringing this up just because to let you know that I'm happy to work with you and or anybody who is interested in really kind of looking at doing this outside the box, as it were. And I'm happy to support you in the tracking of hours and that kind of stuff.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate
Yeah.
that. And I have just one last question that it was kind of touched on by me. I hope I said that right. Sorry if I didn't. Is regarding ordination. I remember, I maybe I have my wires crossed, but I kind of remember reading somewhere about if you're ordained, not necessarily having to go through certain training or education of some sort, because the ordination is considered, the work you did to achieve that ordination is considered part of, I don't know. Like I said, I've been sick a few days, so my head is not quite on straight. But I guess what I'm getting at is I remember Dr. Nita saying something or reading something that he had written about how if you're a Vajrayana vow holder of any kind, like if you're holding Samaya, technically you're not like a lay person in the same way as someone who is just observing like the precepts or something along those lines. And so I'm wondering, does that just holding those vows sort of fulfill a requirement from the perspective of like getting further education or anything like that? Sorry, my head is like not on straight, so I'm not sure I can get this question out the way I'm.
Sure. So I think I got you. So with respect to, for example, like MDiv equivalency, that can be something that is translatable, although one needs to be able to document and prove the hours put in the practice. So let's say one receives, we're talking about Dr. Nita. So let's say one receives all the empowerments for the Utic Nintic. That's one thing, right? But then to be able to demonstrate that you've done X number of hours in retreat, but then the white paper is it's not strict, but it's basically saying, like, let's say you did a 3-year retreat, that can't all count, right? A certain number of retreat hours can count, but then there needs to be some time spent in theological reflection, some time spent in education, formal religious education as well. So there's that. And then so it can count towards that to some extent. With respect to CPE, even if you went to like one of the best schools in the country or in the world and didn't have any CPE, you still wouldn't be able to be hired in a hospital or hospice these days. It's that kind of type of education is really kind of fundamental. Yeah.
I don't want to like, I'm not trying to skip any steps or
Oh,
anything.
no. Yeah, I hear you.
It's kind of fuzzy on what is required and what isn't. If you have this, then you don't have to do this, or you do have to do this. It's helping me to keep it all straight, I guess.
Yeah, it's a little unfortunate that the whole chaplaincy thing is so hard to read, but I get your point.
All
Yeah.
right, that was it for my question.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Thank you. Hi, Jordan.
Hey, Lama Justin. I think you said it a little bit earlier, actually, but I just wanted to clarify, for like payments and stuff.
Mhm.
So we can just sign up like right in January 1 and we're still good. There's not like a
No, yeah, well, January 1st, is the, yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay, cool. Just like how my finances are working out. Just
Yeah. No,
yeah.
yeah, no, I understand. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Well, the one thing we might do is just ask people to send an email if they're going to commit and when they'll make that payment, just so that we're aware of how many people will be in the group, et cetera, and so that all this stuff can be planned. Luke, how are you?
Lama Justin, hello and thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I guess I have a couple of questions. One is just, I guess, from just a practical perspective. I'm assuming that you're planning on running this again, or you might even run it starting in 2025. I just was wanting to understand if that were something that was moving forward, if the timing, place, and circumstances of now aren't working for us. I guess that's question one. And then the question two would really be, I really appreciated hearing that you took Nunjo and you took Nigtik was one of the foundational points of this, as well as the Karma Kagyu. I really feel like that grounding really obviously supports that, and knowing you, it does. I think what I guess my question is really for those, I'm at a place in my own understanding about where I want to move forward. I hadn't really fully considered whether MDiv was a trajectory for me. I had been considering death doula, and I haven't heard necessarily any discussion or anybody asking questions more towards that aim. So I just wondered if you could put some words to that, just about death doula, how this might be useful for those who aren't going towards MDiv.
Sure. Yeah. No. Thank you. And yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. That was a blind spot on my part. Yeah. So I mean, this is again another really strong training for that toolkit. I mean, really, like anything we can do to have a I'm going to use a serious, stable, deep relationship to practices, especially that relate to end of life spiritual care, will be a benefit. And it, most likely will not translate necessarily to somebody asking me to do POA. However, maybe. And the other thing is, again, the more we understand around the death process, the more we have addressed to some extent our fear around it, or our questions around it, or our anxieties around it, or our uncertainties around it, then we're going to be able to be a nice stable presence for others who are going through that process, whether they want a Vajrayana kind of informed level of care or not. We're able to be a support, and then for those who are interested in Vajrayana based end of life spiritual care pieces, then it's exceptionally important. And the interesting thing is like one never knows. Like when I worked in hospice, like there were more people were interested in Buddhist end of life care, but I did have a handful of patients that wanted really traditional Tibetan end of life support. And luckily for the hospice, they had me working there. And so even if it's within the context of death doula work, and or bereavement work too, to be able to bring some of the wisdom of the tradition into the bereavement experience, which obviously it doesn't begin rather right when death begins. Death has happened. It begins, the moment either the patient or the family members of the person are aware of the fact that this is imminent. So that definitely has strong application for that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you
Yeah,
for sharing.
yeah. Yes. And yes, Erickson.
Hi, Lama Justin. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see
Quick
you.
question. Quick question for you, because I know you can't stuff everything into this program. When you had mentioned working with the imam, just out of curiosity, will there be any type of considerations for working with non-theistic chaplains for type of cross-religious sensitivity, things to work on, or if we're working with people who might not be in our faith tradition, basic understandings of things to work with and how to be sensitive to their needs?
Oh, absolutely. So, I like to joke that as Vajrayana practitioners, we're like the 0.05% of spiritual, faith practitioners. According to the Pew Research poll, there's something like in the US, it's between 3% and 2.5% of Americans identify as Buddhist. And then at least, a quarter of those perhaps might identify as Vajrayana. And so I bring this up simply because most of us may never, ever minister to a Vajrayana person, especially if you're working in a public hospital, which means then that the majority of people we're going to be serving are not, they might be a little Buddhist, oriented a little bit, but most won't be. And I think yes, that was when I worked in hospice, I was the go-to person for elderly male Catholics, because a lot of elderly male Catholics were afraid of showing their emotions to their partners, their family members, and definitely did not want to see their priests. And so just being, for example, a male spiritual presence that could listen to them cry, right? Or, provide a non-judgmental presence, and under those circumstances was a huge benefit. So we will definitely be getting into that, because the reality of the situation is there aren't many of us. And hey, hopefully we'll all be there for one another, and hopefully you all will be there for me when it's my time to go. But yes, a ecumenical approach is important, and dealing with I'm glad you brought this up, because it's amazing how defensive we can get sometimes working with spiritual caregivers of other faith traditions, especially when we feel like we might be like in a down power position, in our own mind at the very least. So yeah, we'll definitely get into that.
Yeah, I asked that because while I have some seminary training being Roman Catholic and was studying for the priesthood, it's just like my skills when it comes to relating to my Jewish and Muslim friends, just like I have very cursory knowledge. So just having that sensitivity, realizing I'm not going to get an encyclopedic download, but just the things to be sensitive of, the things that are like you were talking about, the imam, of what centers his faith, is just having a sensitivity towards that and a respect, and to really have an appreciation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bridget.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So my question applies to my personal practice, but I think that it could also apply to others in the group. I already have a number of practices that I do under the guidance of a few teachers and a main teacher. I'm wondering if the practices that are offered in the curriculum, um, what does it mean for someone such as myself or others in the group, that say have been initiated into Chud or Poa practices or Vajrayana or maybe possibly other traditions, but aren't necessarily the exact same lineage. And yeah, what does that mean as far as, let's see, partly we would be being initiated into new practices, but things that we're familiar with. And then is there any, I guess my question is there any tailoring, maybe one-on-one, private customization, I guess, to meeting us where we're at? Um, you know, some of us could be years in practice, and I'm wondering if there's flexibility for that to tailor to who we're practicing from and what practices that we have done and what we might be working on now.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great question. Thank you, Bridget. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Meeting people where they're at is a, you know, big not only value of mine, this is kind of like a key aspect of chaplaincy. I think, you know, the thing is at the same time, like not everybody is necessarily going to be necessarily coming to this from the same place. So the practices will be introduced, and if there's an equivalent practice that somebody, you know, is doing, then, you know, they can go ahead and do this. The thing that I'm interested in, and maybe like hopefully this doesn't sound too sacrilegious, is really like pushing into the heart of the structure of these practices as well, and kind of taking a deep dive into this so that we can really understand what they are about, right? And that will aid us in being, you know, increasingly empowered in our practice, increasingly able to also be able to talk in a sophisticated way about our practice as well, just as much as you might find, you know, again, this is another place where I have seen discrepancies, so to speak, within the context of what Buddhist chaplains and chaplains of other faith traditions will occasionally be presented with. This depends quite a bit on you know, one's formal training and things like this, but it's not uncommon to find Buddhist chaplains who just aren't really willing to go there in terms of talking about what their practice is, right? And really being able to language this. And if anybody wants to move into board certification, for example, as a chaplain, the one thing that you find is that you have to be able to explain your process. It's a little bit like, you know, back when we were much younger in math class, when the teacher would say, show your work, right? You need to be able to actually like language, like, this is what the whole thing is for me, right? This is what it, you know, not only just the dynamics in terms of the structuralism of the practice, but like, this is what it does for me. This is how it changes my experience. This is when I'm in that place of feeling empowered or plugged in or highly connected, right? Being able to language that. And why this is essentially a key factor here is we're going to then be called in to be able to help support others to that same end within their own spirituality, right? And so you know, one of the reasons why at least introducing something that everybody can then connect to, and we can kind of break apart together and analyze together and reflect on together, allows us to be able to have this kind of shared process. Then if, you know, if one's been practicing forever, that's great, and I celebrate that. We don't need to break apart those things, right? And cut to the heart. But this offers us like a kind of unified place to go. And then of course, if somebody's like, oh, but I'm like, you know, I love Cha and I've received all these different things, then come share them with the group. You know, I think this the cohort will be made very strong if everybody can show up and bring, their own experience and wisdom to it. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, it's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Are there any other questions anybody might have? I don't know if, let's see. There was one hand that went down. I don't know if Cyrus is still here, but yeah, so I want to thank everyone for being here. And if you want to, you can always email me if you have questions, or email info@yangtiyoga.com with any questions. And we'll be, this is being recorded, so I'll send the link out for folks who can share it, and we will embed it, in the page for the class. And again, anything that comes up that we may have missed, I'm more than happy to answer. Yeah, I want to thank you all so much for your interest in this, and passion for benefiting others. I hope that you can join us and that this brings benefit. So thank you so much for being you and for showing up, and I'll see you soon. Be well. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.